distinguished panel moderated by Dr. S.K. Sasikumar. Lead panelist for the day, Rizad from ILO, Fahad Ahmed Khan Suri, who is First Secretary, Embassy of India, Kuwait, Ms. Mehru Westwala, who is former GS of Indian Community Relief Fund, Bahrain. And we have representation from the recruiting fraternity as well, Mr. Safwan Yusuf Sheikh, who is CEO of Al Yusuf Enterprises. And all the friends and colleagues who have joined us today and have been very supportive of all our discussions. With that, we will begin today's discussion without wasting any further time. Let me ask our Joint Secretary, Shri Abbagini Ramu, to make the inaugural remarks.
So, Ravi, is Secretary joining?
Sir will join towards the end. You may do the inaugural.
Okay. Anyway, once again, a very warm welcome. Today's panel, moderated by Dr. S.K. Sasikumar, Giri National Labour Institute, and our representative from Embassy, Mr. Fawad Suri, First Secretary in Embassy of India, Kuwait, and Mr. Rizad Chulevinsky, Senior Migration Specialist in Arab States International Labour Organization. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us today. And Ms. Mehru Vesuwala, former GS of Indian Community Relief Fund, Bahrain. Welcome, ma'am. Nice to see you and look forward to hearing from you. And also, let me welcome all the participants who have been always enthusiastic to join our webinars, which we have been doing for the last 1 year. So it is very inspiring and very active association we have with you, the members, and also the participants. So today's particular the topic is of particular relevance for the present scenario. Looking at the evolving landscape of GCC countries, especially after the post-COVID and how things pan out, we wanted to understand. So with this objective, I think this subject has been selected. As you know that COVID disrupted everywhere, any part of the world. I think no part was left untouched by the COVID. So it affected everyone. I think the estimation of effect is very difficult to assess and see that how impact it will be, how long it will be, what kind of impact it will be. So considering that, and there are also kind of policy changes which are being made by countries across the world, especially to meet the emerging situation due to COVID. And today's focus is more on these GCC countries, where is a focus for us because about 80% of Indian immigrants go every year there. So that's why we focused on this subject. So particularly that the new policies which being changed, it can be in favor of migrants also, but at the same time, there are which are not in favor. But I think it is always a dynamic situation, like situations like COVID, which is unprecedented, and they provide a situation to the world to transform. So the transformation can be beneficial for some, but may not be beneficial for others. I think it is for us to see that how to take advantage of that situation. And for example, some of the measures taken by the GCC countries and focusing on more local labor to reduce the exchequer, especially going out of the country, that could go against opportunities our Indian migrants are looking for. But at the same time, I think the technology disruption happened, and there are some sectors where actually there may be opportunities. So it is for us to see that where we are losing opportunities and where we are gaining opportunities. I think that is important for us to know and create that skills where the new opportunities are coming, and then only then we can meet the situation. And I think with these few words, I think I'll just conclude that today is a celebration of a great festival called Mahashivratri. The god Lord Shiva is known for transformation of the world, transformation of the society. Let us see this COVID as an opportunity which transforms the society and world. But at the same time, it creates a lot of disturbances. But let us look at the positive way and look at how to see this new situation to be in favor of migration. So with these few words, I will stop here and I'll once again welcome. I think my secretary also joined. Sir, thank you for joining. And I think today's panel is very interesting. And we also have a representative from our embassy in Kuwait to get the first-hand information about the transformation and the changes being made there. So it would be interesting to hear from Mr. Fawad also. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, sir. With this, we move towards the main panel discussion. I would now introduce our moderator for the day, Dr. S.K. Sasikumar, who is a senior fellow at the V.V. Giri National Labour Institute. He has years of experience of research and training on labour migration issues, and he has been associated with a number of projects and policy studies. And he also sits on the boards of many journals. So, Dr. Sasikumar, the floor is yours to moderate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Surabhi. Respected Mr. Sanjay Bhattacharya, Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. Mr. Abagani Ramu, Joint Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs. Distinguished panelists, the ICM team members, and dear participants. Hearty welcome to this panel discussion on evolving policy landscape of GCC country, a post-COVID analysis. Let me at the outset thank the Ministry of External Affairs and the ICM for giving me this opportunity to moderate this particular discussion, which I'm sure all of us agree pertains to one of the most important themes in the context of international migration. Before I come to the specific panel, it is also a time that we should be appreciating each one of us who is interested in some way or the other or connected with migration to the ICM and the MEA for organizing such panels on a continuous basis. I think what that has done is it has really helped to position international migration as an important subject of public policy discussion in the country. And it is also bringing together a large number of practitioners. It's not only academic, it's not only government, you have recruitment industry, you have employers, as a consequence of which the much needed coherence is what such kinds of panel discussions, and I think it's a fantastic thing. And many of us, when we meet outside and when we interact with each other, they immediately refer to, oh, were you there for this panel or were you there for that panel? That shows that it has had an impact. So I think that it will be taken forward. Coming to this particular theme, as the Joint Secretary rightly said, India-Gulf migration. Obviously, it's one of the core themes in international migration. It's one of the most important migration corridors. It's a migration corridor which has had a long history, particularly in terms of labor migration. It's around in the beginning of the 20th century, more than 100 years since, say, people have been migrating in an organized manner as labor to Gulf countries from India. So evidence show that if you look at the Bahrain Petroleum Company or the Kuwait Oil Company in the early 20th century, around 90%, 95% in some instances, 1920s, 1930s, say of the clerical and technical personnel were from India. So it has had a long history, but it's not a history which had a very linear flow. We have had stabilities. We have instabilities also. Every time, through policies, we have responded to it. That has been one of the merits of the long-term Gulf migration. We had 1973. So we had a huge boom. We responded. Okay, Immigration Act came in. 1990, say, India did one of the greatest evacuation that you could ever think of. 140,000 of Indians in Kuwait were brought back by the Indian government. 2008, again, another crisis. 2010, we bounced back. Now, 2020, there's another crisis. But we need to, as you rightly said, Ramu sir, in the context of today, a great festival day, we should be thinking in terms of bouncing back. But for that, the rejuvenation, what kind of policies we need to look at will depend on how far we are able to understand what is happening in the other part. From an Indian perspective, we should be looking at what kind of sectoral shifts are happening. Are sectoral importance changing? This is the first question. Is the drive toward nationalization going to take a more serious trajectory? Is the Gulf countries going to become more skill selective? Because if you look at the economic diversification plans of the Gulf countries, you see a shift to the hydrocarbon, shift away from the hydrocarbon, more of non-fuel based industries. So what kind of impacts will these have on the future of labor migration? That will be very critical to position our policy, because both India and the Gulf, even today, around 31% of the migrant population in the Gulf are Indians. It's a big number by any stretch of imagination. We receive considerable remittances. Indians have contributed significantly in each and every country. So there is an impact both in the Gulf and the India. So we need to look at how to maximize these developmental outcomes in the context of economic rejuvenation. That, I think, would be the key questions that will be answered by the panel. And we have such a fantastic panel, bringing in some of the best and vivid experience. We have Dr. Raisad, who is a senior migration specialist in the ILO's regional office for Arab states, Beirut. Prior to his joining Beirut, he was in Geneva. He has been looking at issues related to migration from the ILO tripartite constituents. And he has been, in terms of training, he was a lawyer with 13 years of previous experience in academic setting. He has very good understanding about human rights of migrants, labor migration, and various aspects of labor and policy relating to migration. So, Raisad, I'm sure that your value addition, particularly in terms of the coherence involving different tripartite partners, will be very central to this panel. As again, it's wonderful to have Mr. Fahad Ahmed Kansuri. You represent us there. So you are the one to best tell us what's happening there. What kind of transformations are you seeing? What kind of transformations you are visualizing? Both in terms of what is happening, what is expected. He is a person with immense experience. He has been in Kuwait as an Indian Foreign Service officer of the government of India since 2018. He has, prior to that, I was looking at some of his experiences and I was really delighted to see he is a person with immense academic, diversified, rich portfolio, electrical and electronics engineer, postgraduate diploma in management from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, one of the premier institutions on management. And above all, he worked in fixed income securities at a bank in London for 6 years prior to joining the IFS. That is very central because you know how to look at the business then. I'm sure you would be highlighting those business aspects. From that, we switch to a completely another person who is a real grassroots voluntary work, community volunteer. We have Meru. Meru, it's really good to have you in the panel. She has been working very closely with migrant workers, particularly looking at their vulnerabilities, the human rights issues, the domestic sector. She was the General Secretary of the Society for Migrant Workers Protection Society. She was also invited by His Excellency, the Ambassador of India, to join the Emergency Committee of the Indian Community Relief Fund. She had a long stint of around about 20, I think more than 25 years, around 25 years in Bahrain. So she knows the conditions there very well. And she has also been awarded significant meritorious awards for her involvement as a grassroots volunteer to protect the rights of the migrant workers. So welcome, Meru. And we, of course, one very good thing about these panels have been, we always bring in the recruitment into it. Because India, as we know, is one country where recruitment is highly dominated by the private sector. More than around 95% of the total migrants who gets recruited are recruited through the private recruiting agencies. So they play a very central role. To understand Indian migration, we need to bring in more of overseas recruitment understanding. So we have Safwan Yusuf Sheikh, who is the CEO of the Al Yusuf Enterprises, again, a person with tremendous experience in overseas recruitment domain. And he's an alumni of the Wellingham Management Studies in Human Resources, and he has been very closely involved in mapping skill development, upskill, and a very central question, Yusuf, which you will be addressing, employability, international employability. That's what we are looking at. It's not a question of just somebody getting employed. How far the workers are employable. So I'm sure all of us will agree that ICM has managed to put in a fantastic panel. And at the end of the panel, say, Secretary, sir, you have kindly agreed to come over and also make your remarks. Thank you very much for that. So we begin the panel discussion. As has been the remit for me, we have around about 40 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes. Each one of you, 10 minutes is what you should be trying to present. I'm a bit liberal. I will give you half a minute more, each one of you, to wind up. So 10.5 minutes is your outer limit. So Raizad first. After 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a nod. Please wind up after that. Raizad, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Satyabhuma, Joint Secretary, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me extend my gratitude to Dr. Surabhi Singh of the Indian Center for Migration for inviting me to this very, I think, timely and important webinar. Now, what I want to do in my 10 minutes is to provide an ILO perspective, perspective of the International Labour Organization on this evolving policy landscape of GCC countries when it comes to labour migration, in the context of COVID-19, as well as to offer some reflections for the future. So firstly, I will say a few words about the impact of COVID-19 on labour markets and migrant workers in the region. And of course, this is still very much continuing. COVID is still very much with us, unfortunately. Secondly, also very quickly on some of the responses that governments have taken. And finally, to offer some tentative reflections on the future. And I think these can only be tentative reflections. And I see amongst the participants many that also I think will have some good inputs and interventions that will help enrich the discussion. As ILO, we have been documenting on a periodic basis the deep impact of COVID-19 on the world of work globally, as well as in the Arab States region. And that, of course, includes the GCC. So in 2020, ILO estimated that 8.8% of total global working hours were lost relative to the fourth quarter of 2019. So that's an equivalent of 250 million full-time jobs. When we look at the Arab states, the total estimated decline in working hours in 2020 was 9%. So that's equivalent to 5 million full-time jobs. As far as the GCC is concerned, we know, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there's an estimate that this amounts to 10.8% of working hours. And when the UN economic analysis of the situation of COVID in the GCC, we see that a drop of 13% in employment was expected. This was an analysis that was done in September 2020. And in the EUAE, this amounts to around 900,000 jobs. So essentially, a reduction in the population of 10%. So the impact has been significant, and we're still very much not clear what the final evaluation will be. In terms of, and I'll go through this very quickly because I'm sure that you're aware of many of these issues, but we have seen COVID magnifying existing structural labor market and other deficits, what ILO often refers to as decent work deficits in the GCC. We know that there is a deep labor market segmentation when it comes to the employment of nationals and migrant workers in the GCC. And this segmentation is played out very much in the support that has been provided to workers and to businesses during the COVID-19 crisis. And unfortunately, much of that support has been aimed at national workers rather than foreign workers, with some exceptions. We still have the Kapala sponsorship system, and the weaknesses and deficits of that system have come very much to the forefront during the pandemic. The labor protections, and particularly around the payment or late or non-payment of wages, these have been greatly exacerbated during the pandemic. And the fallout with regard to the loss of wages is likely to be huge. We're still very much in the process of documenting the scale of this phenomenon. And another significant gap relates to social protection for migrant workers in the GCC, as well as gaps in terms of accommodation, particularly for low-income workers. And of course, the poor accommodation on offer has greatly contributed to increased infections, COVID-19 infections of low-income workers across the country. And there was also a reference in the introductory remarks to the gaps in cooperation between destination origin countries that have come to light, particularly in the context of the crisis and return, and the related challenge of labor market reintegration in countries of origin. So ILO was already working on most of these areas in the region prior to the crisis to ensure decent work for migrant workers, as well as government's compliance with international labor standards that they have accepted. So these problems are well known, I think. We have seen also during the pandemic, however, that there have been several constructive responses to alleviate the pandemic's impact on migrant workers. And many of them have been short-term, but nonetheless could have longer-term positive consequences. So obviously, some examples of these responses are access to free healthcare for all residents, including those in regular status, particularly in the context of COVID-19 testing and treatment, automatic extension of visas and residence permits. We've seen this in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. Support to businesses, which has covered in some cases the wages of migrant workers. That's been the case in Qatar. Amnesties for migrants in a regular situation, like in Bahrain. Provision of humanitarian assistance to stranded migrants in distress, as well as assistance in return processes. And we've seen this in particular in Kuwait, in the April amnesty, as it was referred to, with regard to the offer of free flights and waiver of penalties for overstaying for those migrant workers in an irregular situation. And we've also seen some facilitation of labor market mobility for those who have lost their jobs, particularly in Qatar and the UAE. And I reference in particular to the Ministry of Human Resources and Amortization virtual labor market. Although that's less, it's not really aimed at workers, it's aimed at employers being able to exchange their workforces. And across these short-term measures, we've seen also important reforms to the Kapala sponsorship system. and particularly in Qatar and the recent announcement in Saudi Arabia. So these have been some constructive responses. Now, finally, let me offer some reflections on how the pandemic might impact on future labour migration to the GCC, which I understand is very much at the core of the discussion today. And as I say, these will be tentative reflections, as I do think significantly more time is needed to evaluate properly how the situation is evolving. And I noticed in the concept note for the webinar, there was a reference to the Skills India Global Skills Gap Report of April 2020. We've seen indeed that some sectors have seen inevitably a reduced demand for migrant workers, particularly sectors like the energy sector because of the fall in oil output and gas output, hospitality, retail, as well as construction, again because of the slowdown with some mega construction or infrastructure projects, and that other job opportunities are appearing in care work, manufacturing, storage industry, real estate, etc., which may lead to more labour mobility. So clearly this is an evolving situation. We know for sure that when it comes to the care sector, including the demand for health professionals as well as lower skilled domestic workers, that this demand remains strong and indeed is growing and is likely to grow further. And when it comes to domestic work, there are a number of reasons for this, and these were presented in an excellent report to the Abu Dhabi Dialogue in 2018 on the future of domestic work in the countries of the GCC. But here we're really talking mainly about low-income domestic workers, many of whom, of course, are women, but of course there are also men domestic workers in the GCC. There's still obviously a lot of work to be done to establish equivalence, and this has already been alluded to, between national skills qualification framework standards and the proposed standards in GCC countries. Indeed, this is also one of the recommendations I see in the Skills Gap report. India is very much at the forefront of such initiatives. One only has to refer to the UAE-India pilot project under the Abu Dhabi Dialogue on a harmonized framework for skills recognition and certification, which of course aims to address the mismatch between worker skills and the requirements of employers. But from our perspective, these initiatives are still very much in a preliminary phase. They've taken place largely at the bilateral level. We feel that more thought needs to be done. In the past, the ILO has worked and continues to work in other regions on regional qualification frameworks. And there have been discussions in the past also on the regional GCC skills qualification framework. And I raised this question as to whether this could be a way to, if you like, improve the skills context, whether there is a need to reconsider the bilateral approach. That's a question I raised for the other panelists and the participants. On the national labour market policies, these are not new, of course, but what we are seeing is that COVID-19 pandemic has given additional stimulus to such policies. Take the recent framework law in Kuwait, which I think fortunately for India and other countries has avoided enshrining actual quotas based on nationality. It's very much a framework law, but we'll have to see how it's implemented in the coming year. And we also have a second edition of a national employment program in Bahrain, which focuses on employment of nationals, in particular in the private sector. I should add here that unfortunately some of these developments have also taken place in a context of increasing hostility and xenophobia towards migrant populations. And we've seen this particularly in Kuwait. However, such policies are still unlikely to impact the demand for low and semi-skilled migrant workers in the private sector. However, they will no doubt continue to shape local perceptions of foreign workers. And that's a related matter that we need to look at. We argue that when it comes to Gulf nationalization policies and the governance of labor migration, these are effectively two sides of the same coin and need to be addressed through the adoption of holistic and coherent employment policies. And there's still a lot of work to be done with regard to nationalization policies and to actually make them respond to real needs and, as was alluded to, diversification strategies in Gulf countries. Another two final points. Another interesting development, I think, has been the increasing willingness of some GCC countries, and particularly Qatar and the UAE, to afford longer-term residence, and in some cases even naturalization, to investors and talent migrants, without linking this residence to a sponsor. However, I think it's highly unlikely that such schemes, although they may expand in terms of highly skilled migrants, it's unlikely that they will be rolled out to other categories, particularly semi- and low-skilled workers. And the final issue, and I'm glad that there was a reference to the recruitment industry, a final issue to bear in mind in the context of COVID, as well as its aftermath, is the increasing cost of labor migration. This is already becoming apparent when it comes to the new deployment that is taking place. In previous research that the ILO conducted with the World Bank, we found that the South Asia GCC migration corridor remains problematic when it comes to the cost of recruitment and the fees and related costs that workers have to pay to obtain a job in the GCC, and that it can even amount to sort of an average of 11 months of the salary. And of course, when it comes to the ILO and its labor standards, worker-related costs are not in compliance. And this is something that needs to be looked at, given that, as I've already mentioned, deployment has started again, and that we have seen recruitment costs rising significantly. And so it's important that these are not passed on to workers. I'll stop there. These are essentially the core of my reflections, and I'm open to participating further in the discussion.
Thank you, Raizad, for that very lucid presentation on some key issues, particularly the impact of the COVID on the job laws, how we need to look at issues like social protection from a futuristic perspective, how we need to look at the sectoral shifts and also link it to the policy structures, both bilateral and multilateral, and also how to integrate it with other aspects like the recruitment and the recruitment costs. Thanks a lot for that very lucid and very informative statement. Now we have Fahad Ahmed Khan Suri. So it's over to you. 11 minutes.
Shri Sanjay Bhattacharya, sir, Secretary CPV and OIA, and my first ambassador in our mission in Cairo. Shri Abagani Ramu, sir, Joint Secretary OIA 1 and CEO of India Center for Migration. Dr. Surabhi Singh, CAO ICM. Distinguished moderator of the discussion, Dr. S.K. Sasikumar, Senior Fellow at the V.V. Giri National Labour Institute. My fellow esteemed panel speakers, distinguished guests and participants of today's discussion. A very good afternoon to all of you from Kuwait. Right at the beginning, I would like to set the context in which we are having this discussion today. Today, we are still in the midst of this crisis that continues to evolve even after 1 year after its initial discovery. COVID-19 initially started as a public health emergency. It has now metamorphosed into a larger global socio-economic and health disruptor of a magnitude hitherto unseen during many lifetimes. The GCC region particularly has been impacted by the twin crisis of COVID-19 and a period of low oil prices. And given the substantial role played by the hydrocarbon sector in the economies of this region, the impact has been higher. So essentially, contraction in the economic activity, which has naturally had an adverse impact on the labor market. And essentially, the sectors which have reduced their capital spending have had a relatively higher impact and on labor hiring, which we have seen in the energy sector. And just like my previous speaker, this previous speaker of this discussion, Mr. Reiser, had mentioned, we've seen energy sector have had an adverse impact in the labor hiring. And talking specifically about Kuwait, currently Kuwait is going through a period of second wave of COVID infections. Prior to the COVID crisis, the number of Indian nationals in Kuwait numbered around 1 million. They are still employed in diverse range of professions and occupations across the entire value chain, from low-skilled and unskilled workers employed mostly in the domestic sector to the most highly qualified professionals employed in leading institutions in Kuwait, especially in healthcare, banking, finance. And all these workers are extremely well regarded and appreciated by all for their hard work, dedication, work ethics, and the overall value they bring to the table. Their contribution to the progress and development of the host country has been acknowledged. We, the Embassy of India in Kuwait, thank the leadership, the government, and the people of the state of Kuwait for hosting the Indian community and also for taking good care, especially during these challenging times. At the Embassy of India, we have dedicated platforms for connecting with Indian nationals in Kuwait through our open house sessions, which is led by His Excellency the Ambassador of India to Kuwait. We have a platform for information sharing as well as grievance redressals. Through our dedicated network for Indian professionals here in Kuwait, we bring together various service expertise and also showcase our offering in this space to the local country and the local market in the form of collaborative events. During the crisis, the embassy, in association with the Indian community in Kuwait, provided necessary assistance to distressed nationals in Kuwait. We've received good support and cooperation from all the concerned authorities of the state of Kuwait while facilitating the return of many of our Indian nationals, including workers, to India under the Vande Bharat mission. While the traditional sectors attracting manpower, especially the services offered to the household sector, will continue to be driven by the labor market dynamics and household preferences for desired labor skill sets and work characteristics, we see that the demand for this particular sector remains strong, and in fact, it's growing. That is one of the reasons why today, amongst the exempted categories who are allowed to return back to Kuwait from India, we have domestic workers, we have healthcare professionals whose demand has equally risen during this period. And while these traditional sectors will, like I said, continue to maintain the current demand, or the demand will go higher, COVID-19 will most definitely redefine the labor market dynamics in most of the other sectors. And in fact, if I may add, it will quicken the pace of adoption of technology. Kuwait has embarked on its long-term economic development plan, Vision 2035, which at its core has a post-oil future defined in terms of its adaptation of technology and its economic diversification plans involving futuristic technologies. That's where we would see that the labor market dynamic and its requirements will also particularly be focused towards such disruptive and technology intensive industries like autonomous technology and robotics. We may be talking about the next generation internet or the Internet of Things, fintech, financial technology innovations, genomics revolution. All this is going to be defining or reshaping not only the global GDP, but the GDP of this region, and especially Kuwait, which has the economic diversification plan centered around technology as its primary economic blueprint for the future. So today, if you're talking about the skills that would be needed or expected from a futuristic job force, we are talking about people with expertise in cloud computing, data and artificial intelligence, high-end engineering. We may be even talking about advanced soft skills like analytical thinking, innovation, creation, creative thinking, complex problem solving. Emotional intelligence may also feature in futuristic job skill sets. So currently, if talking about the immediate impact, yes, marginal laborers have been impacted, but there is a shift happening with the increasing use of digital technology, and which we have already witnessed. Many of our office tasks are now being done digitally. That is happening here in Kuwait as well. These disruptive technologies, which were on the anvil, will now be fast forwarded to the near term. And this is where we see opportunities for our skills, for our labor force to essentially position themselves in a manner that they could leverage and utilize these opportunities. And to stay ahead of this curve, we at the embassy have been engaging with all relevant stakeholders, even in India, to ensure that our institutions and our supply markets remain tuned to the realities of the local markets and the expectations of a future job market. We recently held a roundtable discussion, virtually, of course, due to the safety guidelines of COVID-19, with all the protectorates of immigrants to discuss not only the evolving landscape, but also to brainstorm on our adaptation efforts in this regard. In fact, we at the embassy are planning to celebrate this year as India-Kuwait Year of Science, Technology and Innovation. And as a component to this, we would be hosting many series of events around these subsector or sectors of the futures. And of course, we'll also be complementing that with focused discussions on these futuristic skills. We will be organizing these along with our Indian Professionals Network, which is a platform that we created for bringing all our professionals on the same platform here. So this is what I had to say from from our end in terms of the perspectives from the local market. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, wonderful. Thank you, really excellent presentation, crisp, very, very analytically strong, because we need to look at migration contours beyond what is existing today. I think Mr. Fahad has very clearly laid the foundation for it. I've also been, many of us have been thinking about it. Isn't it that we need to think of Gulf as a major source of even our professional migration? I think that is very evident from the kind of aspects that he brought on table. Very key point: technology intensive, the kind of skills that will be. If it's not a question of 1 or 2 years, it's a question of 10 years, 20 years down the line. If you're talking about policy landscape, Fawad, you said a very important thing. And even if you look at the hiring practices, there are studies, say, done by Oxford Martin School, which studies on technology and employment. And in India itself, there have been studies which look at how technology is impacting hiring. Many a times we focus too much on domain expertise. You said a very central thing there. Even soft skills, the kind of learning agility, the kind of positive attitude, the kind of interpersonal skills, that is going to be the key determining factor for hiring practices across the globe. I'm so glad that you raised these fundamental issues, that we need to look at India-Gulf migration from a more of a futuristic perspective, rather than sometimes getting stuck and grounded on a particular pattern of migration. Yes, that might continue. It's not that low-skill migration will wither away, but along with it, if we can manage a higher level of migration, it is going to have significant impacts both in India as well as their contribution to Kuwait. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Now we come to Ms. Meru. Meru, we really are privileged that you're there because you know the grassroots level situation, the vulnerabilities of the workers, at much more than any one of us who is present here. You worked in Bahrain for a long time, and we keenly look forward to listen to you. Meru, 11 minutes. Meru, please unmute your mic. Please unmute your mic. Please unmute your mic. You're not audible. Still not audible. Please unmute. There's a button below your screen. Unmute it. Please unmute. And now you speak.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. All of us can hear you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, India Center for Migration and respected officials from the Ministry of External Affairs and my fellow panelists for giving me this opportunity to come and be part of this webinar. I'm sorry, I think I seem to be having some problem with my...
But you're audible. You can continue if there is any problem.
Okay, if you can hear me, then I will continue because there seems to be some problem with the video.
That's okay. We can hear you. Please continue.
Okay, so thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And as you have pointed out, I will give you a perspective more from the grassroots level, because that is the community whom I have been involved with in Bahrain. I was there for almost 25 years, from 1994 until I returned back permanently to India in 2019. And the large part of my work has been working with particularly two sectors, construction and the domestic sector workers. Now, as my fellow panelists earlier have spoken about, and we know that from India, there is a large number of expatriates who go and work and live and have a very fruitful and a good experience of Gulf migration. Yet, I want to bring to this panel the issues which are pertaining to construction and domestic sector particularly. These workers go, as does everyone else, on a system of under the sponsorship system or the kafala system. And we do know that while there has been a lot of criticism about the system, and there have been many responses to correct the anomalies that are existing within the system, yet at the core of the kafala system is the control and the power dynamics which come into play. Particularly, we find that in construction and domestic sector workers, they are very, very dependent upon their employees. And in this period of COVID, particularly, we saw how en masse these workers, particularly in construction, overnight lost jobs, were out on the road. Some of them literally had no money to pay rent, no money to feed themselves, and had no money to even repatriate themselves back to the home country. Domestic sector workers found themselves kind of locked in the house. They were unable to even access remedies. So I feel that we need to focus more on these two sectors, which are facing a lot of stress, particularly in the GCC countries, and we need to be able to address the issues. India definitely is sending, diverse workforce, and the people who are skilled, the people who have the ability to take care of themselves. I don't want to focus too much on those two categories of people, but in the GCC, for example, the trend to diversify, the trend to look at how to engage their own nationals in jobs has been going on for a long time. The pandemic has brought to the forefront what we have seen as trends which have been put into place maybe 10, 15 years ago. So whether it was the first financial crisis we found in 2008, which led to the countries to respond to shifts in their policy thinking to reduce dependence on foreign workers. to increase the participation of their own nationals within the workforce, to increase workers' participation of their own nationals, particularly in the private sector, and to reduce this dependence on foreign workers. This motion has been already put in place. When I had gone to Bahrain in 1994, virtually the entire service sector and was dominated by foreigners. And we found that most of them were coming from the country of Philippines. And gradually, in this period of 25 years, I have seen, workers from the local population coming into participating in, in service sector, in tourism, in hospitality, in aviation. All these sectors, you find that the jobs which were primarily held by foreigners are now being held by nationals. So there is that fear which there is there about demographic imbalance, which is there particularly, and in certain countries like Qatar and UAE, where the foreign population is far beyond, I mean, overwhelmingly more or less as compared to the number of foreign workers present in the country. You can see that these countries are looking at how to address these imbalances which are there. Recently, we found that Kuwait last year in July had introduced the expat quota bill, where they are talking about reducing the number of foreign workers substantially. And then again, we are finding in Oman last year again, as a result of the pandemic, that even some jobs like delivery will be handled now by their own nationals and not by foreigners. So the shift has been happening, and the shift will continue to happen. And the pandemic has brought to, I would say the xenophobia that has been there, particularly for your workers who live in crowded labor camps. We are finding that, they were branded as virus carriers. They were looked down upon. And there were some very crude comments that even came out from various GCC countries, which was throw them into the desert and, we don't want them and they should go because they are the ones who are bringing COVID into the country. But you have to address that these people are paid a pittance. Their leverage for better negotiating for better conditions for themselves is limited because there is no collective bargaining permitted in these countries. And their ability to even demand or to come forward and speak out for themselves is limited. So, these they bore the brunt of the entire COVID, the workers, particularly in construction and domestic sector. So what do we need to do as, as a country, or to make sure that the visuals that emerged and the kind of stories that came out from the Gulf during the pandemic, how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we prevent our workers from being so dehumanized in these countries? And that said, I will say that Indian workers are definitely respected and they are welcomed. And two sectors, which is construction and domestic work, will continue to have a demand for workers from India and other parts of South Asia. But how do we skill these workers? How do we reskill them? How do we upskill them? How do we make the years of experience that they have spent working in the Gulf count, so that whether they are over there, they are able to leverage for better wages, better contracts for themselves, or if they were to return back to India, how do we again have these skills utilized within our own country? Because we do find that there is a lot of skill gain that does happen when these workers go and work in the GCC countries. Even a domestic worker who is largely coming from a very rural background, from the state of maybe Andhra Pradesh or Telangana, and goes there, and if she is able to complete her tenure and her contract, picks up enormous skills over there. She is able to maybe handle all the white appliances. She is able to perhaps, handle childcare, handle taking care of the elderly, or the cooking skills. There are a number of skills that they acquire during their tenure of employment in the GCC. Yet when they come back, they find themselves back to being, just another domestic worker who has to struggle once again to either find a job in the home country or again, go to a recruitment agent or a sub-agent and go back to the same kind of salary, the same kind of job. And it's a continuous cycle for these people. So I think recently the government of India introduced a platform called Swadesh, which was the skill mapping of workers who are returning and how to get them into contact with employers within India who are looking for certain skill sets. So we have to look at ways and means where we can expand these kind of programs to include this category of workers so that they can break away from this cycle of always starting again from the bottom. It cannot be that when you return after 2, 4, 6 years of employment and the kind of experience that you have gained over there, that they count for nothing when you are back either in the home country or if you are deployed again back to the GCC countries, you are again finding yourself in the same starting position. And this is a loophole that many employers do exploit because it is easier for them to terminate a worker rather than pay higher wages. And this competition between, the different countries for the same jobs and, the Gulf countries themselves look for different labor markets where they can find cheaper labor. So I saw when I was in Bahrain and we operated a shelter for abused domestic workers and even for women workers, how even within the domestic sector, the demography was changing. Whereas earlier you would find a lot of domestic workers from the Philippines, from India, from Sri Lanka. We started having so many more coming in from the African countries, from Ethiopia, from Kenya, from Ghana. So, and we had these same women coming with very similar problems, which is the wages were not being given as promised. The hours of work were extremely exploitative. The working conditions were harsh, and there was no sort of networks for social protection, social security. So I think we need to, as a as a country and the various panelists who are here and who are in a position to impact policy, look a little bit more, particularly towards these two vulnerable sectors, because they definitely need a lot more support than, say, people who are already skilled and have the ability to navigate, recruitment and to be able to update their own CVs and to put their experiences and, have pathways to a better career. So I would really like, that we need to focus on particularly getting very robust and concrete data on how many of our workers are particularly going in these two sectors, what is the kind of skills that they go with, what is the kind of experience they return with, how can we re-employ them within our own countries, particularly I would say domestic workers, because there are some, in my own experience, I have seen some really, really bad cases of abuse and, dehumanization of these women. So I always wonder that, I'm now back and I'm living in Gurgaon, and there is such a demand for domestic workers right here in the NCR area, which pay good salaries and households which need a trained, skilled domestic worker. So why is it that we are still looking at sending these women to, the GCC countries, where I'm sure different embassies would have had a lot of experience in dealing with the problems of women and within the shelter, when these women do stay, the kind of stories and the incidents that they narrate to us about what all they had to endure during their time in employment over there. So why are we not training them and skilling them and sending them to our metros and to the cities within India for employment? Because the salaries which are being offered over there, and they're getting, at least in Bahrain, I found Indian workers were typically getting somewhere between 80 to 100 dinars a month, which is roughly around 200 to 280 US dollars per month. And this is a salary that is could be made in India itself. So why send them all the way out over there, you know? So these are aspects that I think we need to really look at. We need to address the vulnerabilities which is there, and we need to focus particularly on skilling. I think skilling is really, really very important, and also help these people to update their own CVs or whichever way, somewhere where they are able to negotiate
Meru,
better terms and
can you
conditions for
please wind
themselves.
up?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You have very clearly highlighted the need to look at the migration from a continuum perspective. Also look at recognition of skills, which the Ministry of External Affairs has taken as a very key priority in India. And also a very important point that you raised, we have to look at, because one of the impacts that the COVID has had, not only on international migration, on migration per se, is that sometimes it is creating some kind of a, negativities about migrants, or migrations not having a safe, such kinds of, say, elements are coming in. We need to put an end to that and look at migration from a very positive perspective. I mean, both in terms of their contribution as well as how they can be done in a very safe manner. So thank you so much. We now
Dr. Sasikumar, you need to unmute your mic, please.
sorry, I did not do that. Sorry, sorry. So it's all yours, Safwan.
Good day, everybody. Am I audible?
You are audible.
Yeah, first of all, gratitude to ICM, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of today's dialogue and represent human resource agencies, HRA. Let me first start by extending my best wishes of International Women's Week to all the ladies sharing this digital space with us. Now, on the line of today's dialogue, international recruitment is commonly understood as facilitating a service-bound contract where the three parties are involved. That is FE, foreign employer, HRA, and the candidate. Today, I will highlight a few essential aspects by the candidate's perspective on the administrative side, which stands as a significant reason for the cause of delay in migration process, and further the FE market to other supply countries, and thus India lose the opportunities. These are even beyond the control of FE and HRA. I will request ICM team to please turn on the slide, please. Next slide, please. To start with, let us analyze the current medical process and the challenges. Specifically for GCC, there is a body called GAMCA, like GCC Approved Medical Center Association, which acts as a nodal body to monitor and facilitate all the GCC pre-medical tests. And basic examinations are covered, like physical examination, X-ray, like blood examination and cardiac examination. The process is very simple, where candidate need to go register himself, paying 10 US dollars. Then the specific medical center will be assigned. Then he'll go for test in that medical center, and once he's passed, the report will be issued. Next slide, please. Our main concern with this medical test is the cost which this candidate, he bear. That is 60 US dollar. And now, due to the current circumstances, there's a mandatory PCR test required, which costs another 10 to 15 US dollar, and which can be carried through any ICMR test in India. Now, the second concern with the medical test is the Indian medical centers, the GAMCA approved medical centers. The report which they generate are country specific. And in this situation, for example, if a candidate, he gets a job where he does a medical for Saudi Arabia, he gets a job in some other GCC country, then there is a lock-in period for 90 days. He need to wait for 90 days, and later he need to go through again re-medical, means again he need to spend money in medical. And such practices many a time stand as a only reason for applicant to miss the better opportunities and further additional medical cost for migration. Next slide, please. Sir, I will put up my suggestion here. As we all know together, with the current circumstances, the current benchmark is a PCR test, which is globally accepted even by GCC countries. And we have 2,410 government approved ICMR centers, whereas the GAMCA centers are only 97. So if we propose, at least for time being in this COVID period, at least ICMR centers can get a chance to carry on this GCC medical as well, which can very well be clubbed in a package and even the cost can come down. Secondly, the report which is generated by the Indian medical centers should be unified for GCC, because as per the GAMCA head office in Saudi Arabia, there has no such instruction to the Indian medical centers that only the report will be specific to one country. That should be GCC. That is the name itself defined. And secondly, sir, it's a request, like if we can include pre-medical under Pravasi Bima Yojana, which is a Government of India initiative. Next slide, please. Second most important concern, we always speak about the blue collars, but let me also speak about the engineers, the white collars. Here, if they want to secure a job overseas, especially in GCC countries, they need to get their degree attested by the respective embassies. Now, prior the degree get attested, there is a time frame. The turnaround time, it starts from the candidate will submit his degree for HRD in his state, which will take 21 days, then MEA approximately 3 days, then that will be submitted in the respective embassies. Then embassies will trigger a verification to the respective universities from where he had passed out. Sir, my request here, with the e-migrate 2.0, which is shortly, which will be launched shortly, why not we can introduce a centralized attestation process which exists in the, which is existing now with the data flow for the medical health practitioners. So such applicant like white collars and the engineers, they themselves can register there with their KYC. They can initiate an HRD and verification process. This can be clubbed online, and this will bring down the attestation process nearly for 1 or 2 weeks, which is now around more than 2 months, sir. So one more thing I wish to propose here, we can even run a pilot project to include qualification in e-passport, which we are already testing. So we can give a trial run there, and such practice is already existing in Egypt on a physical passport. Next slide, please. So this is a small concern as an HRA. Sir, we have a very wonderful concept as an initiative by Government of India for all these startups which are registered and recognized by DPIIT. So this startup, they are exempted from the tough principles selecting, like the requirements of previous experience, prior turnover, etc. are exempted for them. And this gives the startup a chance to bid for the trial orders with Government of India, and this makes them likely a chance to win a new project. So my suggestion here, when we have such a beautiful concept, everything is very well defined. So we as an HRA, if first of all we must get an industry status, this will allow us a one window access to bid all the contract and avail the benefit grants of various Government of India scheme under skill development and employment. That comes from MSD, that comes from NSDC, that comes from MSME, because sir, such measures will channelize the active participants of hundreds of HRA. And sir, we are already generating and mapping future skill with overseas employability since 1978. And we second the call of Prime Minister of India, that is global to local. And now ma'am, you can drop the slide, please. Okay, now most importantly, post-COVID era, the emerging destinations what we identify would be Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, based on the scheduled event and ongoing projects. And it will be, we assume it will be limited for Oman, Kuwait, considering the implementation of the nationalized policy to reserve jobs for locals. And the industries which will gain are, of course, healthcare, hospitality, oil and gas maintenance, dry dock, solar and electric automobiles. Sir, in terms of skill, to be specifically for overseas, we need to clearly identify the skilled personnel from right away from the sector skill council, from MSD, from the CSR program, that those who wish to pursue their career overseas, number one, first we need to identify and check their medical fitness test to make sure they are fit for overseas assignment. Secondly, such group must undergo a third-party assessment, industry-based, by an international assessment bodies. Like specifically, I'll speak on GCC, TUV, AWS, OPTO, City and Guilds, etc. If these candidates go through this kind of third-party assessment, they will be selected only based on the assessment card, not even interviews required for them. And sir, present scenario, like the neighboring countries have an upper hand since the foreign embassies are operational and the volume of recruitment already diverted to them, which we as an Indian HRA, we were holding for months since lockdown. Because FE, they don't just demand competitive manpower, they want in the shortest period of time. And sir, international recruitment, what I believe we will soon witness a J curve. The reason is an immediate investment by the governments, by the corporates, and even the startups will be venturing into new areas. All will together gear up to fuel the economy. But then we don't know how the curve is going to look like because there is so much uncertainty. So the level of concern is optimism. It could go wrong again, means the economy could slow down and many businesses may collapse because we don't know when exactly, but maybe by 2023 and 2024, the market will start to get back to real. It will get back to normal. Now, I will specifically put this as a concern and a request with Mr. Sanjay Bhattacharya. Sir, as our life is getting driven by the technology, by personal meetings like this, events, marketing, all modernized digitally. Now, sir, when we receive a job order through a foreign employer who is registered on e-migrate, qualifying all the mandatory requirements approved by the Ministry of External Affairs, he raises the demand letter over like online, and we as an HRA, we second the MEA registered FE and we render our services. But tomorrow, if the FE business get affected and slow down or close down and candidates are demobilized, then what will be the protocol and SOP to address such grievances? Because under such circumstances, we as an HRA will have a very limited role, sir. Like we need to identify and specifically clear the role of the Indian missions, POE, PGE, HRA candidate. This will be a very crucial part to frame in the policy. With this, I rest my presentation. Thank you everybody for your patience in hearing. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Safwan. You have definitely highlighted some of the practical issues and also linked it to how far it can influence the contours of labor migration. We are all really delighted that Secretary Sir is with us. He has been listening to all the presentations from the beginning very, very eagerly. Sir, if it is comfortable, we will be very happy if you could kindly make your remarks before we open the floor for discussion. Secretary Sir.
Thank you so much for a very engrossing conversation that's been ongoing. I must say that this is a subject that we attach the highest importance to. It is well known that the Gulf region, the GCC region in particular, has seen very high flows of migration from India. We also know that the Indians have contributed greatly to the national economies of all the GCC countries and continue to be the most preferred migrant in all these countries. Notwithstanding all that, we have also seen that even before COVID, due to the economic transitions that are taking place, particularly because of technological changes, economic downturn, the price of oil, there were certain shifts in the migration flows. And I think in some ways what COVID has done has exacerbated the situation. And in some ways has also caused a certain level of discomfort within the migrant community. What we have seen in the last year or so, ever since the effects of the pandemic came into being, was that there were certain myths that were very predominant, which have not entirely come out to be true. But there are also other realizations that we have to account for. The first myth that we realized was that very large numbers of Indians would be displaced and would have to come back home. We have seen in the case of the Vande Bharat mission that the number of people who've come back from the Gulf region have been of reasonable numbers. Of course, there are many who've lost their jobs. And I think there are many who still have pending grievances with their employers or their conditions back in the country where they come from. But overall, the magnitude of the problem was much less than what it was predicted to be. Um, this has caused a certain issue back at home about the employability of such returning migrants, about how do we engage them, and also about how we get them back, because there are many people right through the pandemic who've been going back. I think it was mentioned that people in the healthcare sector, the medical sector, have essentially been going back, and these have actually grown in numbers. But there have actually also been other sectors which have seen certain revival. You know, we've seen certain revival in the construction industry, certain revival in the managerial qualities. But what we do see is that there is a definite shift in the kind of patterns. While the demand function for the white collar jobs seem to be growing at a lesser pace, even declining in many cases, many sectors, those for the blue collar, particularly which are more technology intensive, have actually shown a reasonable increase. This was brought out in one of the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas conferences that we had for the Gulf region. And we found that the private sector is actually being very agile with their country plans about the expansion plans, because as we see, the Gulf region being one of the more progressive, advanced, adaptive of technology, is more likely to bring in some of these technological developments, the new industry, perhaps at a faster rate and perhaps earlier than many others. And so this would provide a new pool of investment. If you look at it from the perspective of policy, this then provides a certain dilemma for us, because what we do have to take care of and be concerned about, and I noticed many of the practical aspects that were brought out, particularly by Meru and Yusuf, is that we have to be extremely sensitive about the movements of white-collar movements, white-collar workers, particularly those who belong to the more vulnerable sections. And how do we, at the end of the day, provide an environment which provides them a certain level of security, a certain level of assurance that their conditions will not be severely affected adversely. It is for this purpose, and I think there's been some discussion on skilling as well, but I think skilling is a much more complicated issue, because along with skilling comes in the issues of certification, which are jointly recognized, and that proves to be a more difficult task. We have tried some examples with countries outside the GCC, where the question of certification has been much easier to resolve. And we shall see whether we can have such experiments with some of the GCC countries as well. Because at the end of the day, our objective is that the white collar worker should have a suitable corridor in which he or she can go to the traditional markets, destinations in the Gulf region, and have a certain level of expectation realized. We would also wish that over a period of time and across sectors, that there would be a certain level of value addition in terms of the remunerations that they get. And that's why it is important to work collaboratively with all the stakeholders so that we can realize this objective. The other part, which is about the white collar employees or the professionals, what we do find is that new opportunities are definitely coming up and looking very promising in the GCC countries. And I would say that I'm extremely optimistic that in the next couple of years, this is an area in which India should be able to make significant advance and headway. But we do need certain enabling agreements which will ensure that we have these mobilities well protected and that we have certain level of social security agreements so that wherever necessary, they're not so applicable in the Gulf region in large, but in certain countries it is applicable, that we have such arrangements in place so that we can actually derive the maximum benefit. I believe that Indians have always been migrants, and the essence of this is likely to continue for a long time. I do notice that some of the recent policy initiatives in the Gulf region have brought about, it was also mentioned about localization, which might seem to reduce the numbers of those who are coming from across the seas. But I do expect that the impact on the Indian migrant community would perhaps be less than the others. It is also very important to stay competitive in this regard, and therefore the policy initiatives, the coordination between the stakeholders needs to be strengthened much further. I particularly appreciated the comments that came from our ILO colleague who was on the panel, and I think many of the practical issues that you mentioned about the bilateral understandings are extremely important, but we do need to get into a larger framework which I fully accept and understand. I was absolutely delighted to see Fahad on the panel. Fahad and I had worked together some years ago in Cairo, and I'm so pleased to see that he is leading the charge to ensure a better prospect for migrants from India into the state of Kuwait, with whom we have the most wonderful relations. In conclusion, I would say this, that the pandemic has brought about a certain realization, but this had actually, the trend had started even before that. But what we have to do is we have to learn to be more nimble. We have to be more adaptive. I think we have to look for higher value addition for every migrant that is going out, so that he or she would be able to bring back a more stable, secure, and higher package for his family's requirements, and thereby contribute to the overall national development effort. So I think what we do need is a more stable, but at the same time sustainable model that can work for the GCC. And this will happen because at the national level, the policy priorities will also have to figure in the new migration corridors that are opening up. And we do see that there are new possibilities that are emerging in East Asia and in certain parts of Europe, where there is growing demand for Indian migrant workers. It's not that they would replace those who went to the Gulf or who used to traditionally go to the Gulf, but these are new opportunities that everyone can explore. At the end of the thing, I would just wish to say that this has been a truly enlightening conversation between all the partners that we've had on the panel today. And these would provide us with very interesting guidelines and guideposts as we look at how policy formulation happens here in India, because we are looking at a new era for the Indian migrant going overseas. Thank you very much for giving me the time and the opportunity to hear all of you and then share some of my initial thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that very considered and a very comprehensive statement pertaining to how we would look at international migration policy in the context of India, Gulf, the aspect of value addition, the aspect of how to tap new opportunities, the aspect of policy coherence, and most importantly, the aspect of the adaptiveness. I think that these are going to be the central of the migration policy horizon or landscape in the coming years. That was a wonderful statement from you, sir. Thank you so much. See, what we will do is, I request, as Surabhi has been telling all of you, to post your questions on the chat, but Raizad has to leave for another meeting. So Raizad, there is one small question that has been posted in the chat. I'm just reading it out for you. I'm just summarizing it for you. Basically, Mr. Jayakumar says that there is an optimism coming in from several documents regarding the GCC in terms of what is in the pipeline. But ILO predicts 6 million jobs are lost Yakumar, of course, is not what will be lost, what has been lost. Anyway, so Raizad, you can respond to that question, as well as you can take a couple of 1 or 2 minutes to sum up what you would like to for the panel to carry. Raizad, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sasi Kumar, and I also enjoyed very much listening to the Secretary's remarks. With regard to the question, first of all, just to clarify, and I think Dr. Sasi Kumar, you've already done so to some extent, these are, of course, they're not actually job losses. I mean, the way the ILO estimates were done, they focused on how much working time was lost and the equivalence of that working time to job losses. And in 2020, and the estimate is 5 million jobs actually. But yes, of course, as we've been discussing, there are opportunities. Now, of course, the question arises in the coming year, to what extent will these job losses, which have definitely occurred, be compensated through the opportunities that are coming up? And that is something that at this moment in time, it's impossible to say. And just a couple of reflections very quickly on the discussion, and I welcome very much that it was very much a multi-stakeholder discussion, which I think when we discuss the governance of labor migration and these issues is essential. And what often arises when we talk about migration in the context of a corridor like India to the GCC or South Asia to the GCC is this the balancing act that needs to be performed with regard to, promoting employment opportunities for nationals abroad and, securing sufficient protection. And that always is a very delicate issue, and that came very much out of the discussion. And as the Secretary said, with reference to issues around social protection, of course, the better the workers are protected, the better their conditions are at destination, the more benefits that will reap in terms of economic as well as social benefits for countries sending the workers, as well as for the workers themselves and their families, of course. And the ILO works on both elements, where we're not just focusing on labor standards and protection, but also the broader employment and economic issues. And here, just to give you a very quick example, in Qatar for the moment, we have this program. And in terms of reforming the sponsorship system, the Kafala sponsorship system, one of the things that we are trying to show to the private sector in Qatar that it actually benefits in more internal labor market mobility for workers, because the business model in many of these countries is based on getting a worker for 2 years, whatever the situation. And of course, that also can have a spin-off in terms of, skills, right? Skilling. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area, but in Qatar we have had some success, and we're making similar arguments in other GCC countries. And finally, very quickly, my colleague Shabari, who had to leave early, also raised this point about, future of health migration, given that the demand remains strong and is growing. And we're also working very much on not just focusing on health migration per se, but also making the linkages between this type of migration as well as the broader care economy. And of course, here, the domestic work sector, the household sector, has a very important role to play in that regard. And we're hoping, for the information of those in the call to do more work on this in the GCC in the near future. So they're essentially my remarks. There's a lot more that can be said, I think. And thank you again for the invitation. And my apology for that. I will have to now transfer to my other meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Raizad. Say, Fahad, there was one question which, of course, Raizad also addressed in some way. Shabri has raised a question about how do you see the future of health worker migration, especially what do you see it in the context of Kuwait? I mean, by the time I expect others to post some more questions, but if you can take that up, we will be grateful. How do you see future of health worker migration, particularly in the context of Kuwait?
Right. Thank you for that question. As I had mentioned during my initial remarks as well, healthcare is a segment which has seen a resurgent demand during the crisis. And in terms of bilateral collaboration at the government-to-government level as well, India had sent a 15-member rapid response medical team, especially to develop local market, develop the host government's capabilities to meet the challenges of the COVID-19 during the peak period way back in April 2020. And over the last year, we've seen that this demand for healthcare workers, especially in the wake of a number of, especially in the wake of shortages which resulted from the on account of many of our healthcare workers being stranded in India. The problem exacerbated during this period. So this will continue. This demand will continue to be there across all sectors, be it for specialist doctors, paramedics, nurses. We see that this will continue, and this will continue to remain strong. From our side, our healthcare professionals are regarded as one of the best in this country. So that is in terms of futuristic projections as well. India leads in terms of medical technologies and the skills of our medical professionals. So I see that we would continue to remain competitive and continue to our services will continue to be demanded in this particular sector.
Thank you so much. We have Ms. Pooja Varnekar, who is from the mission in Abu Dhabi, who is there. And we would be very glad if she could come over and express her views, particularly from the perspective of what she is looking at in a future aspect of migration to UAE. Pooja, please, it's your turn now. Pooja is also an Indian Foreign Service officer who is presently posted in Abu Dhabi. Pooja, can you hear me? I think there's some connectivity issue with Pooja. Can you hear me? Can you hear us? I think there's some connectivity issue. Let's take it forward. Meru, you had raised that we need to look at these construction and domestic as two key sectors, and you also said that there's a need to build reliable data around it. That is one of the most important aspects that you raised. From your experience in Bahrain, what do you think are some of the best methods to evolve reliable data on these two sectors of workers? Meru, please.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sasikumar. So with regard to construction and domestic sector, and particularly in domestic sector, what we had noted during my work with this sector of workers in Bahrain was that most of them were exiting India through the route of visit visas. And when they leave India through the route of visit visas, they are actually bypassing all the various support structures and protection measures that have been put in place by the government of India. So largely their recruitment process was being facilitated by either sub-agents or from within family and friends or their extended community network within their social circle. And this leaves them incredibly vulnerable when they come there. Most of the times they would not have proper documents. They would not have an existing contract. They would not even at times know the name of their employer or even know which country they have come to. I mean, it didn't really matter. They would not know whether they were going to Dubai or whether they were coming to Bahrain. It really didn't matter because they had left the entire recruitment process to agents, sub-agents, family members, etc. So how do you capture this data? Because these people do reach, they do get employed in households within the GCC. And then when they do, if you at all you come to hear of them is when they reach their embassy and they say that, I've been working for 6 months, I haven't been paid, and I've had, non-payment of wages, or I've had physical abuse. So how do you provide redressal for these people? Because there is really no employer-employee kind of a contract or a relationship that can be established. And therefore, when they come forward, it is difficult to deal and address their cases and recover their lost wages. So I think it is quite well known the route that some of the workers are leaving, especially those who are coming through the irregular and informal channels. So how do we plug this gap? How do we make sure that every worker who's leaving for employment to the GCC countries is going through the legal and the regular route? Safe migration is the first cornerstone for workers to not only be able to have a better migration experience while they're abroad, but also for the embassies and for people who are helping these workers in the host country to be able to get them justice should they have any problems within their work environment time. So I think e-migrate has been there, and I think it is capturing data, particularly for those who are coming to work with proper documents and through proper contracts, which have been attested. But I will give you an example. I mean, when we were in Bahrain, for example, the Labor Market Regulatory Authority would periodically put out data on their website on the number of different nationalities who were employed as domestic workers. And I remember at one time, out of a total of 105,000 foreign domestic workers, India was listed as 45,000 Indian domestic workers. And yet the embassy barely had information on, say, 3,000. So there was this gap of already 41,000 in a small country like Bahrain. And Bahrain is a small country, it's the size of, like, say, a Gurgaon. So it is easy for the workers to come forward to reach their embassy, for, sympathetic people on the road who would drop the worker outside the embassy and they would reach. But there was this huge gap which was there. So clearly, this is something that the government of India or perhaps the embassies in the GCC countries need to either extract this data from the immigration authorities in the host country to have a more accurate understanding of how many workers, particularly women, who are really in the most vulnerable sector, are reaching these countries. And when you will have this...
Okay, thank you, Mehru. Thanks for that very informed comment. We now have Safan. Safan, I have two small questions for you from the chat. One is, apart from the increase in domestic workers, demand for domestic workers and nurses, other low-skilled women workers or medium-skilled women workers, do you see any up in terms of recruitment? Overall, second question is, overall, how do you look at recruitment per se? It's going to pick up or it's going to dampen for a small time? Safwan?
Yes, sir.
Please.
On your question, yeah. On your question regards to low-skilled women, I assume the housekeeping industry will come up. And on the second question of the fate of recruitment, as I said, of course, we are just waiting for the the international corridors, the international flights to start. We have a lot of demands at present. Actually, for at least Kickstart will have a lot of demands which is pending for a longer time. For like 6 months or maybe 1 year, there'll be a sufficient demand to cater. And after that, we need to wait and watch. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very crisp reply. Let's wind up this discussion. As the person who moderated this discussion, it was really a privilege that we could listen to some of the brilliant analysts and practitioners, and also listen to Secretary. I thank each of the panelists and also all the participants who were listening to it and also who posted some interesting questions. Such panels, as I said in the beginning, is giving us a lot of ideas. And I'm sure those who are dealing with policy, research, analysis, everything is going to be benefited a lot. Thank you so much. And I now hand over to Dr. Priyadarshika Subha of the ICM. It's over to you.
Thank you so much, sir. I hope I'm audible. Okay.
Yes.
You are audible.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Shri Sanjay Bhattacharya, Secretary CPV and OIA, Shri Yogeshwar Sangwan, PGE, Shri Abagani Ramu, Joint Secretary OIA1, our esteemed panelists and moderator, dignitaries from government bodies and key organizations that have joined us today. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. On behalf of the India Center for Migration, I would like to thank our speakers for presenting their work and analysis on this crucial issue today. I would also like to thank our moderator for the day for efficiently coordinating this discourse and for enriching today's discussion with his noteworthy inputs. Let me also take this opportunity to express gratitude to Shri Sanjay Bhattacharya sir for the crucial insights and interventions on the issue, and Shri Abagani Ramu for delivering his discerning opening remarks. My sincere thanks to all our invitees for expressing their thoughts and contributing to knowledge development on this issue. Today's virtual discussion was initiated to understand the changes brought about due to the pandemic and the implications on the labor market of the GCC region. The takeaways of this discussion has conceivably enabled us to develop better strategies to navigate the policy changes of the GCC countries. On this note, I would like to once again thank all those who joined us today on this virtual platform and provided their insight and feedback on this important issue. With these words, I wish to thank you and I wish you a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you all.